Welcome back to another We Ourselves video. Today I want to talk about something that's been on my mind for a long time as a Star Wars fan. And that issue is the desire by some among the Star Wars fan group to limit the scope of the original Star Wars to what they feel is George Lucas's original intent. That every time we meet a new Jedi who survived the Purge, or Order 66, that somehow we're diluting George Lucas's original vision. Let me begin by stating some facts about myself as a Star Wars fan. Not only did I see the original trilogy, as well as the prequel trilogy, I'm also a fan of the Star Wars original expanded universe. Now, I didn't like every book in the expanded universe, but there was a good number of the books and stories that I did like. Of course, I was a fan of the Thrawn trilogy, and I plan to do a video about that later. You know, the trilogy that was originally done by Timothy Zahn. The latter ones, I've read those, but I like the original better. And again, I have a separate video that talks about that. But I also liked other notable series like The Legacy of the Force, which focused in on Han and Leia's twin children, Jaina and Jacen Solo, who were now the embodiment of the Force. Personally, that was the Rey and Kylo Ren original story, and I do not understand why Disney bastardized the original concept, which would have still given them a central, powerful female protagonist that they wanted. This video is not about that. The purpose of this video is to discuss something that I perceive in the comments of Star Wars YouTube creators, many of which I actually have followed for years. And that's the idea or the exasperation they express with the introduction of every new Jedi who survived Order 66, whether in live action, the TV shows, movies, novels, or video games. Somehow they feel this is diluting George Lucas's original vision for his property. And of course, as you can tell by my voice, I don't totally agree with that analysis. And in this video, I'm going to cover the points why I think that people who subscribe to this belief are limiting Star Wars in a way that the creator, George Lucas, never intended. From a purely story and narrative idea, having a survivor of a once great time, that is narrative gold. Just consider what the original Star Wars would be like if we did not have a survivor to tell Luke and us, the audience, about the Jedi. And I don't mean somebody talking about it as myth like the later sequel movies tried to do. The story, the original Star Wars movie, wouldn't have worked as well for us if we did not have Obi-Wan to tell us the story of the Jedi. It's narrative gold. It's the thing that ignited our imaginations about the period of time that the Jedis were alive, you had the Clone Wars, and etc. It just made the story better. And that brings me to my first point when it comes to this perception that introducing surviving Jedis dilutes the original material. From the very beginning, with the first movie, we were introduced to a Jedi who survived the Purge. George Lucas wrote the first movie, and he introduced Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jedi Knight who survived Vader and the Emperor's purge of the Jedi Order. Having that surviving Jedi added to the magic of the entire narrative, as I said before. Being able to hear somebody who was old enough to have been there at the height of the Jedi engaged Luke's imagination and, by extension, fired our imagination. That was our introduction to the Star Wars universe. So from the very foundation, George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, introduced us to the concept of a Jedi surviving the Purge. But that wasn't enough. George Lucas came back with his second movie, The Empire Strikes Back, and this time he presents Yoda.
You will go to the Dagobah system.
Dagobah system.
There you will learn from Yoda, the Jedi Master who instructed me.
Now, later we discovered that Yoda was not only a Jedi Master, but he was in charge of the Jedi Council and would have been undesirable number one to the Empire. Yet he was able to survive the Purge and hide out on a planet called Dagobah. Luke was able to go there, and he was able to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi eventually. We discover in this movie, The Empire Strikes Back, that Yoda is 900 years old, or he's been training Jedis for 800 or 900 years. He literally was alive during the height of the Jedi Order. So once again, the creator of Star Wars, within the span of 2 movies, introduced 2 powerful Jedi who survived Order 66, or what we would later come to know as Order 66. Lucas clearly did not have a problem with Jedi surviving the Purge, and his idea is at odds with fans who favor a strict interpretation of the original event. And I think it's important to mention here also that George Lucas had an original plan for the 3rd movie where Luke's twin sister would come forward and save the day. The twin sister was not originally Leia. Reading the biographies and history of George Lucas and his decision-making at the time, we now know that he changed his mind more than once, and Leia became Luke's twin sister later when he was done with making the films and he was going to take a break and focus on raising his kids. So the original idea to have a twin of Luke, a girl on the other side of the galaxy, being trained as a Jedi, and from indications far more capable than Luke Skywalker, was George Lucas's idea. No matter how you look at the original plan, George Lucas had a Force-sensitive person or an actual Jedi Master on the other side of the universe training Luke's twin sister. And that meant that George Lucas himself was demonstrating once again that there were survivors of the Purge and that it was always part of his original intent. But let's come forward to the prequels, where we discover more about Yoda. We find out that he was in charge of the Jedi Order, as I said before, and as such, he would have been undesirable number 1 for the Emperor and later Vader. Indeed, we find out that when he fights the Emperor in the Senate room and he gets away, the Emperor is adamant in telling his people that, look, you have to make sure he's dead. The thing that I really want to point out, though, is the scene that happens a little before when Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda return to the temple and review the records. It's at that moment that they discover Anakin has fallen to the dark side and he's now called Darth Vader. But the truly interesting aspect of this sequence is when Obi-Wan suggests that they should change the warning beacon that was being used to lure surviving Jedi to the temple and a death trap. Let's keep in mind that these prequel movies were written by George Lucas himself and nobody else. That statement assumes that there are Jedi who weren't on missions with clones and therefore would have survived, heard the beacon later, and been drawn to the temple and into an ambush. There's a line in the Attack of the Clones when Mace Windu says that there's not enough Jedi to protect the galaxy if war breaks out between the Republic and the Separatists. They, the Jedi, are not warriors. They are peacekeepers. So it just makes sense that not all Jedis would have been on the battlefield and on the front lines with the clones. It just makes sense that there were Jedis all over the galaxy doing all kinds of things. And that's why when George Lucas wrote that scene, he had Obi-Wan suggest that they change the message to tell surviving Jedi to stay away from Coruscant in the temple and go into hiding. And Yoda agreed. If Lucas was concerned or wanted to make it clear beyond a doubt that Obi-Wan and Yoda and maybe a few other Jedis were the only ones to survive, this scene would have been much different. He would have had one of them basically state that they were all that was left of the Order and they needed to go into hiding. But that's not exactly what George Lucas did. He left it open from a story point of view for surviving Jedis to exist. And I think it's interesting that later in the animated TV show Star Wars Rebels, we actually see that recorded message when it's played by Ezra after he finds the Jedi holocron in Kanan's quarters. So, once again, George Lucas himself set up the framework from a narrative point of view for there to be other Jedi who survived the Purge. That's why I find it puzzling that every time there's another Jedi introduced in a video game or TV show who survived the Purge, you have certain members of the fandom who get exasperated and express the opinion that somehow we're diluting and watering down George Lucas's original intent and idea for Order 66. That we shouldn't have these Jedis just floating around the galaxy when they were all killed, that was never stated in the movies. When Obi-Wan tells the story, he says to Luke that the Jedi are all but extinct. His statement left it open and implied there were other Jedi who survived. And why not? Because he was a survivor and he was sitting there talking to Luke. And so for me, discovering another Jedi here or there that survived the Purge has never diluted the original idea for me at all, because the original idea included that very concept. The last thing I want to say here is about the creative process itself. I would just hope that Star Wars fans would not become so dogmatic that they would squeeze Star Wars into a shape that the original creator never intended. I truly believe George Lucas's own statement when he said that if he had done the sequels the way he wanted to do the sequels, old-time fans would have absolutely hated it. And I believe him at that, because people have taken over and they've established their own orthodoxy when it comes to the Star Wars mythos. In The Return of the Jedi, we know Yoda tells Luke that he'll be the last of the Jedi. But I think most people leave out a very important fact about George Lucas, particularly true at that time. His personal life and decisions affected the Star Wars canon. It's common knowledge that Lucas had decided to step away from the films after the messy divorce with his wife, and he wanted to focus on his family. Yoda's statement in Return of the Jedi therefore contradicted his comment to Obi-Wan in the previous movie, where he said, "There is another. We don't have to do mental gymnastics to find an in-world excuse." Lucas changed his mind, and his real-world decision affected the Star Wars canon. Likewise, nearly 20 years later, when he wrote and directed his final Star Wars film, Revenge of the Sith, he was in a different headspace. If Lucas wanted to adhere to that line from Return of the Jedi, all he had to do was leave out the Jedi beacon scene in Revenge of the Sith. But he didn't. So for me, Lucas's own final statement about the Jedi, at least between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, was that many Jedi had survived. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the matter. As usual, like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you in the next video.